Hello and welcome to the Christ Baptist Church devotional here as we're going through various books of the Bible, chapter by chapter, seeing if we can pull an application out while we get to know our Bibles a lot more. We've gone through many books of the Bible and now we're going to start at the beginning. We've had some times looking at the time of Israel when they were taken captive in Babylon and what happened during the time from the books of Daniel all the way to Malachi, and now we're going to look at the book of Genesis, one chapter at a time. And before we start, I just want to ask a question that was asked of me long ago as I spoke with some folks that the question came that in related to the gospel, why is John 3:16, if John 3:16 is the most important verse in the Bible that talks about salvation and the gospel, why didn't God put it at the first verse? Why didn't God make that be the first verse so we could just get right to it and understand and be saved? Well, you can't understand John 3:16 unless you understand Genesis 1:1 and what comes out after that. Because John 3:16 is an answer to a problem. And if we don't know the problem, then John 3:16 is irrelevant. Well, the book of Genesis explains the problem, begins to explain the problem, and it starts to tell us the solution and move toward the solution as we get there. And our problem is that we don't know God. We can't know who God is. We don't know about his goodness. We don't know about his sovereignty. We don't know about what he has done. We see a world without God. We're born as people who are born into the world, and we don't believe there is a God because we believe we are the center of the universe. We believe we're God. And so we need this book to begin to tell us, no, there is a God, and he created everything, including you. And it begins that way as we start to unfold the book of Genesis and take a look at this verse by verse. It's not going to be a very technical or detailed explanation of science and all of that, because I will say this: if you're God and you explain how you created the world, you're not going to be using science to do that, because science didn't come before God. God is the one who actually gave us science, but he didn't give us science until he created people. And so it makes sense that God created the world in his way, using the supernatural, and then put man in place to run things via the natural. That's how you would do it if you were God. And so with that in mind, let's take a look here at the first chapter of the book of Genesis, and maybe we'll draw out some key observations to learn about how to understand and how to worship through the book of Genesis. So we start in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and there we read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And we see right away that there is just a lot packed in this very first sentence, because right there in the very first, in the beginning, we see time. We see time, that there's time actually created. At the beginning of time, God created, there's our force of action there, the heavens and the earth. That is material world, matter that's there, and space. And so we've got a place to put things, and we have things to put in the space. And the action is God created, and God is the force behind all of that. That's all in Genesis 1:1. And if you're God and you're going to announce how you created the earth and the heavens, how would you say it? You would do it this way: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And verse 2 tells us an explanation about that earth. Now, I just want to explain something. Some of you might have heard something called the gap theory, which is trying to understand about dinosaurs and where they came from, and the theories today of evolution, which are based on the fact that God did not create the heavens and the earth, and based on a few bones that were found saying these creatures existed. We have to know when they were created, and the only way you can do it without God is you have millions and millions of years. And so they believe that science, which is really not science, because it's not done through experimentation, not done through duplication, that these animals lived millions of years ago, and therefore it was really millions of years ago rather than just the few years that the Bible talks about. And so a gap theory details the idea of in between verses 1:1 and 1:2, that's when a bunch of dinosaurs ruled the earth. And the dinosaurs were there, and it was a long time, but then Satan fell during that time, and God judged Satan, put him on the earth and judged the earth, and therefore he made the earth formless and void. And he made it all like a ball of clay and squished it back up in his hand again, and then he recreated the earth in 6 days. So we have a 6-day creation as well as millions of years, all in Genesis 1, 1, and 2. And I'll just tell you that it's impossible for that to happen because verse 2 irrefutably is explaining the earth that was created in verse 1. It's not saying it became formless and void. The verb there is it was, not became. The earth was formless and void. It was created formless and void. And darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. It's almost like you would put brackets in verse 2 and say, now the earth, let's talk about the earth. It was formless and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep. And so we see in verses 1, 1 and 1, 2, right there at the beginning, he created the heavens and the earth. And verse 2 is to say, let me show you what it looked like at first. There was no forming and there was no filling taking place at all. Now, at the same time that he created the heavens and the earth, God then speaks. First words of God. Then God said, let there be light. And there was light. Notice the words, let there be. I'm going to point this out to you. This is a very important observation as we make it on down. God said, let there be light, and there was light. So he said, be light, and there was. God saw that the light was good. So when he says it and it happens that fast, God immediately judged it and saw that it was good. And then God separated the light from the darkness. So the light and the dark don't intermix. And so we see in verse 5, then God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So when there was light, he spoke it into existence. Let there be light. It was. And really, we got to be careful. We can't say, well, the light, if there was no sun and moon, where'd the light come from? Oh, the light must have been God. Well, we don't know, because if the light was God, the light would have been there. Because God would have been there and the light would have come from God. It would have already been there. But it wasn't. There wasn't light. There was darkness over the surface of the deep in what he created. When he said, let there be light, there was light. Where did it come from? We have no idea, and we don't have to have a cause for it because it is created supernaturally. Light just showed up. And God separated it from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Now that's important that he gave each one a distinction there. But I want you to look at the very next phrase in verse 5, and there was evening and there was morning one day. And what's very important about this is he did not say first day, like it's the first day. This is not the first day. It's impossible. It does not say that. That's not what Moses wrote in Hebrew. He wrote one day, or day one. And the reason he wrote one day there, as opposed to in verse 8, he says second. In verse 13, he says a third. In verse 19, he says a fourth. And the reason he did that is because he's defining the measurement of a day. A day is an evening and a morning. When you have an evening, when you have a morning, you have a day. Very important, which tells us that this can't be used as a measurement of millions of years, like the word day is used metaphorically for millions of years, because it is actually defined as a unit of measure in verse 5. There was evening and there was morning, and it's one day, one of those things. We call it a day, one of them. And that was one day, which was the first one of those. And so verse 6 kicks in, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse, separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. So what an expanse is an atmosphere, air, levels of air, separating waters that are on the earth, because the earth is essentially a ball of water that covers land. Land is underneath the water, ball of water. Air, and then there's moisture, like clouds, moisture, and basically a canopy of water above. And so God made that. He said, let there be. Again, first he said, let there be light. Now he says, let there be an expanse. And it happened. And then again, now here it is. There was evening and there was morning, a second day. The second one of those measurements I gave you, called the day. Very important. It's the second one of those things that equal a day. It's not the next set of millions of years. It is a second, evening and morning. So that's day 2, and then we get to After that evening and morning, second day, God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. Now focus on that word, the dry land. Moses uses a very specific word that means dry land, no mud. There's no water anywhere. So what happened was the waters moved around and land came up and it was dry. It was not just dirt that was mud. It was dry land. Very specific word that Moses used. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So we see here that God saw that this was good here on the dry land. He made that. And so with that, we now have a ball of water, but the land's all pushed into one place and it's dry. And that's what we see after an evening and a morning, and it was after day 3. And well, actually, God saw that it was good the land there. But while the land was made, we're still on day 3, verse 11. God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them, and it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind, and God saw that it was good. So this is after day 3 here. God saw that this was good. Everything God did, he saw that it was good. When he spoke it into existence, he sees that it's good. And then there was evening and there was morning, a third day. And what's important about this is, first, in a miraculous supernatural event, the waters are there, but the dry land pops up, and the waters recede into another place. So essentially all the continents were in one spot. So all came up and it was dry. And right after that, it says the earth brought forth vegetation. So let the earth sprout vegetation. So it was all there in the earth. The seeds were all there in the earth, and it came up. And very importantly, it says it's fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, plants yielding seed. So basically everything was ready for germination. It came out, and boom, out comes fruit, out comes plants, seed, nuts, everything is right there, and it's actually bearing. It didn't take a long time, years and years and years, to actually grow and then harvest a crop. It all came right out ripe. That's what the verses say. And again, if you were God and you did this in a supernatural way, you would just have it be, whether it's not repeatable. It's not like we can repeat what God did. Verse 14, then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and it was so. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Again, we see God now placing essentially the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky, in the whole sky of the universe. He put them in there, but they're having a purpose. God supernaturally had the light go from light to day of what was happening with the earth, marking time so that we would always have a day. Now he put something in, and it's in place so that it would now go for thousands of years. It would continue on. It would carry on without God's supernatural intervention. He now puts something in that is natural, just like he did with the plants. The plants and the trees, he supernaturally put them in, but now it begins a natural process. He supernaturally put the sun and the moon in the sky, and it now begins a natural process. And what is that natural process? It's to give us light. That's what they're for. And it's to separate day from night. It's to make day and night happen. So days and nights happen. So invariably, this created the rotation of the solar system right here, and it made time begin to march forward in a natural way. So God set things in place supernaturally, and now he put something in place so that it would carry on in what we would call natural, only because we can see it every day. But it's still supernatural because nobody knows what causes the sun to do what it does, and no one knows about gravity and how that works exactly. We can measure it to some degree, but we can't determine the ultimate cause. So God made the two lights, the sun and the moon, to govern the night and to govern the day, and the stars are there as well. And it's to give light on the earth, to separate light from dark, but it's also very clearly there in verse 14, for signs, seasons, days, and years. First time that word's used, years. Interesting. If day meant millions of years, why have years here that are marked by the sun and the moon? That the sun and the moon are for days. If the sun and the moon are for days, and ultimately years, how can then days mean millions of years? It doesn't make any sense. If Moses was trying to confuse people, I guess he would mean that. But Moses is not trying to confuse people. He's trying to say this is how God's making it as clear as possible for that to happen. So day 4, we now have a way to naturally measure time in a repeatable way. Now we get to day 5 because, again, we know that there was evening and morning, a 4th day. In verse 20, then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. Let birds fly over the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. And God created the great sea monsters, every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. There was evening and there was morning, a 5th day. Again, the 5th one of those things called a day, an evening and a morning, very clear. God set it up. He measured the day with evening and morning, and then said the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th of those things are now in view. And he created great swarms of living creatures. Basically, the things that are cold-blooded or have 3 chambers in their heart. It's basically the birds and the fish. Non-mammals. These are not mammals here. So it's basically swarms of the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. So everything living in the water was created there. They do not breathe air. And then birds, which will need oxygen, but their hearts have 3 chambers, and they are flying above the earth. So flying and floating, you could say almost, there in the water and the air. And God saw that it's good, so he created them. And here now we see in verse 22, different than what we saw in the plants, God blessed them. So he's moving up in what he's doing. He put the plants in place once the dry land appeared. Now the plants sprouted all this stuff. But once he created the animals with eyes and nose and so forth, God blessed them and saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters, and the birds multiply on the earth. I want you to reproduce naturally. I don't create and keep recreating more of you. I created you once, and now you naturally reproduce. I created the plants. Supernaturally, naturally, you reproduce. You see, that's what he's doing. I created time, and I'm marking time with day and night, and then I create the systems in place for that to happen, and naturally, it measures time. And then verse 24. God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind, and it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, and God saw that it was good. So day 6 here, we already passed day 5. First thing God does is he says, let the earth bring forth living creatures. Cattle, creeping things, lizards, snakes, reptiles, as well as all mammals are there. And it's after their kind. So things that are in a particular group that we call kind, like dogs are a kind, cats are a kind, cows are a kind. They're not related. You don't get one from the other. You don't cross over. And for sure, you don't cross over reptiles into mammals. You can't do that. And so these are things that did not evolve, but they're all after their kind, which means kinds don't jump. You don't jump from one kind to another. Very clear, God put it in there so that we have these particular things that we might call species. And so that's what we do. We separate them into these various kinds. Not necessarily every single kind there is today, because species can keep reproducing different kinds of species, different kinds of dogs over the years. And so he did that, and God saw that it was good, but he's not done. And then we get to something that's very important. And verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. A couple of observations here. God changes in what's happening. First, notice he says, let us make man in our image. Very clearly, let us. I remember the first time I read this in the Hebrew Bible, it says, let us. And it's in that third person plural. Let us make. And I thought, whoa, this is fascinating here. We are making right here. And so you see it written in the actual language of Moses. It's not I will, it's let us. And what we see there is we as Christians would see right here, this is an allusion to the Trinity here involved in making. Now, that's the only time right here in verse 26 it says, let us do that. Every other time it's what? It's just the word God, Elohim. God says, let there be. Let there be, let there be. Let there be light, he says. And he said, let this expanse be, let there be an expanse. And he said, let the dry land appear, let the heavens be gathered into one place. And so let there be lights, and let the waters teem with swarms. Let these things happen. But when it comes to man here, even after the cattle, he said, let the earth fill up these things. But then when it comes to man, he said, now let us make. Let us make man in our image. It's interesting. Man is in the image of God, but it's in the image of the Godhead, in the image of our image. Now there's three persons, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and they're all God. And let him be made in our image. We see this in the New Testament. All aspects of the Trinity are involved in our salvation. All aspects of the Trinity are involved in our creation. Let us make man in our image. And this is not saying let man appear like he happens out of the, we know he came out of the dust of the ground, but let it happen. But this is very clearly God saying, let us make. We're taking a personal involvement here in the creation of man, and he's in our image according to our likeness. There's such a close comparison in what God does with us in bringing us to him so that we can identify with him, different than the animals. The animals don't see their creator. They know that their creator feeds them and they operate off of instinct, but they can never know him. They can never know who he is and what he's like, and they can never know his love. We, however, are made in his image according to his likeness of the Trinity, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and everything else on the earth. So we rule over that. That's a blessing that he gives to us. And after that, we see in verse 27, God created man in his own image. Us, the Godhead created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created him. So there we have man and female. Male and female, husband and wife. We're going to see this in chapter 2 in tomorrow's devotion. And he blessed them. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over everything. Our goal, our command for God is to go explore the earth, understand everything that's in it, and rule it and make it work for you. It does not have rights. It does not have a claim on anything. It is there to serve you, and you are to explore it, excavate it, and use it. That's the command in verse 28. He reiterates it in verses 29 and 30. God said, behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed that's on the surface of the earth, every tree that is fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, everything that moves on the earth, which is life. I've given every green plant for food, and it was so. Man was supposed to be a vegetarian to start with. There it is. He's given them all plants to eat, not everything else, not the living things. He's supposed to use those living things. But he eats the plants. That's what God says. And the Godhead created man in his own image. not let there be man. Very different. Again, all this is supernatural, where God then put in natural systems so that it runs self-sustaining. The universe orbits. People reproduce. And so God started it off supernaturally, and then it begins. And what comes with God creating man and creating man to subdue it is what? Science, logic, reason. All those things are packed in here in verses 27 to 31. There isn't logic, reason, science, wisdom, and all of that before this. There's no need for it because it's animals. But once man comes in the image of man, God is a God of logic. So guess what goes in man? Logic. God is a God of order. What goes in man? Order. So the scientific method comes into man at his creation after all that God did already. And man measures it in that way. So we see at the very end, God saw all that he'd made, and behold, it was very good. Notice the difference. It's not just good, very good when God got done. And we're going to see how come it's very good now as opposed to just good. And we'll see that in tomorrow's devotion. And there was evening and morning the sixth day. Now, I just want to make up a very simple point of application. Why did God give us this chapter on creation? What is this all about? I'll tell you what this is all about. God explains it to us that he created supernaturally, and he doesn't tell us how things work supernaturally. He put a system in place that is able to run naturally, but it was introduced supernaturally. And why did he do that? Well, creating him in his image means we have his mind and we're pursuing God. But essentially, Genesis 1 to 31 tells us something that Solomon writes about in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He's also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. No matter how much any person studies, no matter how many rocks they dig up, how many fossils they think they've got, they'll never find out what happened at the beginning, ever. That's exactly what Solomon says. Yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. He'll never know the beginning, he'll never know the end by his own efforts. The only way he'll know about what happened at the beginning, read Genesis 1, verses 1 to 31. That's what happened. Take it. It's a supernatural introduction that God supernaturally gave us a system that can run by itself until he is completed with its usage, and then he burns it up. That's what happens. So we have a desire in our heart to know it. He put eternity in our hearts, but we'll never figure it out apart from just reading Genesis 1, verses 1 to 31. That's why you can't try to go look for science and all the things that are going on with science to answer what did God do in Genesis 1. It's not there. He didn't use any of those things. He just said, let there be, and it happened. Now, in the application on this, we look and what do we want to do with Genesis and how we want to find it, go there. I want to give you one picture. We have 31 verses to tell us how God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1 to 31. But when we just skip over a chapter to Genesis chapter 4, we see a sacrifice taking place in Genesis chapter 4, verse 4. There's worship. Cain and Abel bring sacrifices to God. There's worship that takes place. And from that point on, from Genesis 4, all the way to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, God instructs us on how to worship him. He tells us how he expects to be worshiped. As sinful creatures, we will worship him this way. That's the expectation of your Creator. This is what you do. Noah put a sacrifice in to worship. We see continued worship from Genesis chapter 4 all the way to the end of Deuteronomy. That's what God gave us so that we could understand in those 5 books of Moses how to worship God. He gave us only 31 verses on how he created the entire universe. Where do you think God's priority is? His priority is you worship me because look what I can do in 31 verses. And so this is what you do. You don't try to dissect it all and say, oh, I now figured out how you did it. And that's easy, so we can all explain it. No, he wants us to turn around and say, because it's there, this is what we do, and we're called to worship a creator of God who made us in his image, very different from all the rest of creation, including all the animals, the fish, the birds, everything. And because we're blessed with that and are given charge to have dominion over all of it, we worship. That's the opening of Genesis chapter 1. And I think we know why now. We begin to understand what the question is of why do we need John 3:16? Well, because look what he did in Genesis 1, and we begin to unfold what happened as humanity chose sin over God, and now we've got a big problem. And we'll see that. But this is the opening of Genesis chapter 1. I hope I helped you get through some of those technical details, even though I didn't want to be technical, about understanding creation and how to be able to answer some of those difficult questions people might be asking you on how God created the heavens and the earth. We'll see you on the next devotion.